Welcome. I'm Marie Anzalone, and I'd like to welcome you to a presentation on sensory integration and self-regulation. And I'm going to start very basic and start by defining what sensory integration is. Sensory integration is an approach to intervention with young children that was developed by Jean Ayres, an occupational therapist. And she defined it as the organization of sensory information for use. There's two very important parts of this that I want to begin with. First, it's about organization. When you're organizing input, that implies that there's a relative complexity of the input so that you're bringing together sensory input from multiple modalities and trying to make sense of a whole in your world. The other aspect of the input is that it's about using the input, which means that sensory input is not passively applied to a child, but the child is actively taking in input and responding to the environment actively in the process of organization and interacting with that environment. Most lectures that you've heard on sensory integration probably talk about the neuroscience underlying this theory. I am purposefully not talking about that neuroscience today, not because it's not important, it's essential, but because I want you as educators to really begin to understand how to look at the children in a different way, and then through seeing them, start to hypothesize what might be going on in each child's sensory processing capacity. So let's talk about what sensory integration is and what it looks like. First of all, sensory integration is a process that occurs in all of us. It's not just about children who are having problems. And that process is a temperament-related factor. If you think about temperament, reactivity is one of the primary aspects of temperament that you think about and evaluate in children. It underlies personality, and it highlights the fact that we all take in and process sensation differently. Think about somebody who wakes up in the morning perky. That person doesn't really need a whole lot of sensory input to get started and to begin their day and to begin interacting with their environment. In contrast, some of us take a whole lot more time to get organized in the morning, to get started. I, for example, take at least 2 hours to wake up. I'm a slow starter. It takes a lot of sensory input for me to get going, and I have a higher threshold. And when I'm staying with somebody who's kind of perky, it's kind of hard for me. So it's that idea that we're all different, and that difference defines us in a way that underlies personality and how we interact with our environment. It also means that we can use this theory to understand ourselves and others in our world without necessarily thinking about dysfunction. What you want to think about is that all of us are under a normal curve. Those of us in the middle are doing fine. It doesn't get in the way of our participation. What we need to think about is those children that are at the extremes. It's the children that are at the extremes where it gets in the way of their participation that we want to start thinking about sensory integration as a way of categorizing dysfunction and as a model of intervention. So we're going to be talking about all three aspects of sensory integration today, very briefly. So thinking about that process of sensory integration, want to think about the first thing that we do. The first thing that we do is we take in sensation. That underlies the process of sensory integration, and that results in our ability to modulate our responsivity. If you think about it, if a sound happened at the back of the room while you're intently listening to me right now, you might startle a little, but you probably wouldn't jump out of your chair. Some of the children that we work with would be so over-responsive to that sensory input that they would be startled to the point where you'd have to calm them down. Other children, in contrast, probably wouldn't even notice that loud sound, and they go through the world missing so many of the details that are essential in their learning process. After we take in that input, register it, and modulate it, we then have to interpret it. And the process of that is discrimination, it's cognitive, but it's also affective. I like that sound, I didn't like that sound, or that sound is. This is very cognitive, it's an internal process, and again, it relates to our prior experience. Is this a safe sound? Do I have to worry about it? And then finally, we have to use the input. We use sensory input, among other things, to organize our action and also as part of learning. If I'm not taking in input, if I find it aversive or if I don't have the capacity to notice it, I'm not able to take it in and learn, and I'm not able to do anything about it. And these two steps, in particular this step, are the ones that you as educators are really thinking about and working with. So as occupational therapists, I'm concerned about that first step and helping children to be able to take in information so that they're ready to learn. I'm also interested to some extent in their ability to organize that information to provide the basis for environmental interaction. The process of sensory registration is very complex and it is subjective, and it's based on learning a whole lot about sensory input. Now, if I asked you right now about how many sensory modalities there are, you'd probably tell me that there's 5. 5 senses basically does not consider the 2 most important senses to sensory integration, and that's vestibular and proprioception. So we have vision, I always get this wrong, vision, auditory, taste, smell, and touch. But there's also proprioception, the processing of movement within the environment, and proprioception, which is the internal body sense of your body in movement. Think about yourself doing your exercise in the morning. What happens if you don't do your exercise? I don't do a whole lot of exercise, but those of you who do, you probably feel tired or a little grumpy or not quite ready for interaction if you haven't had your exercise routine. That's the proprioceptive input that provides some of the basis for your organization of yourself within the environment. And so want to think about the modalities, but don't forget those internal or hidden modalities that are really grounded in the body, because sensory integration, above all, is a body-based neurological process. We also want to think about the intensity of that input, because all touch, for example, is not the same. What I want you to do is try this. If you're in your office alone, you might want to close the door or find somebody to do it with you. Take your finger and press the back of your hand really firmly. Now take your finger and just touch very, very lightly on the back of your hand. Which one is more intense? Now take your hand and touch the palm of your hand really lightly. Now which one's more intense? Most of you are going to say that the touch on the palm of your hand is much more intense, and a lot of you are going to be scratching, which is what I want to do now. And then, so it's on a continuum. Now take your finger and touch your upper lip, okay? Now which one's more intense? Is it the light touch on the back of your hand or that light touch on your lip? Now we're starting to get into the fact that there's subjectivity, there's individual differences. Some of you think that the hand is more intense, others are thinking that the face is more intense. All of us take in and process sensory input differently. So there's nothing wrong with the way we do it, but it's important to remember that what I think is intense, you may not think is intense. Now I'm going to try to go into a different sensory modality. Take your hand and put it in front of you. Now, very quickly, bring it to your face. All right? Now do that to the person next to you. Bring your hand to their face very quickly. I'll bet that it was much more intense when somebody else did it to you than when you did it to the other person. Or whatever, when somebody else did it rather than when you did it to yourself. Now take your face and go very quickly to the person next to you and use your face as the object that's looming. What you're going to find is that's much, much more intense than even the hand when somebody else did it. That illustrates 2 points that's important about intensity. One, when I apply sensory input to you, it's perceived differently than when you're applying it to yourself. Do you ever have a child who will give you a hug but won't take a hug from you? That's because information is processed differently when you initiate the action yourself. The other thing is that when you're using your face, that is a much more intense stimulus than any other part of the body. Think about your children with autism, how they don't look at the face. Maybe they're not looking at the face because of the intensity of the sensory input that is yielded by that input, by that experience. Temple Grandin once said that she could look at faces, but when she looks at the face, it's like looking into the sun. She can do it, but it's very costly to her. Do you want to cost children that much energy and that much capacity for making sense of their sensory input? So think about when you're running around and doing that, look at my face, look at me. Maybe what you're doing is asking for the child to take in very intense input, but what are you getting out of it? Are you really getting relationships? Just a question. I'm not telling you that there's an answer. I want to try one more thing, and I'm going to borrow Vanna here. I want you to go, hand to hand, and then touch the back and the front. So what I'm doing is touching my finger and Vanna's, Terry's finger together. And I want you to do it, Terry.
Okay.
So how does that feel?
It feels really weird.
Thank you, Vanna. Thank you, Terry. So what we're talking about here is I touched the back and the front of my finger. At least that's what my hand told me. But when I felt it, and when Terry felt it, what she felt was only the front. And it does feel weird, because that's because your motor system is intrinsically linked with your sensory system. So when you're engaging in a motor activity, that motor activity tends to modulate or downgrade the sensory input that is yielded by that sensory experience. So that, again, the child who is hugging you and not accepting a hug is not controlling. It's not about behavior, but it's really a child who is processing that input differently. The sensory and the motor systems are intrinsically linked. And so the child actively engaging in input is processing a very different experience than the child who is just taking in passive input. So again, the intensity goes up and the child can make more sense out of the experienced and actively engaged in activity. The other thing to think about is duration. Some of you may still feel the light touches on your hands, your face, or that finger experience. And that's what duration is. The effect of a sensory stimulus within the central nervous system lasts much longer than the absolute duration of the sensory event in the environment. And that's important to think about with our children. Think about the children who fall apart during transitions. Those children who are having problems with transitions are having difficulty letting go of one stimulus set because possibly they don't recover from a sensory event as quickly as others do. That's one of the big aspects of individual differences in sensory processing. So you're thinking about the straw that broke the camel's back. It's not one sensory event that can lead to overstimulation. It's the accumulation of sensory input over time that leads to that sensory experience of overwhelming sensory input. So what you want to think about is give children time to recover. For those children who don't recover quickly, think about the duration. How long is that taking for them to be able to move on to the next sensory event? You may need to slow down. You may need to provide more time for transition or some cool down experiences for the child. The final aspect of sensory input that you want to think of that does contribute to registration is whether that input is in the foreground or the background. Think about the sensory input that's coming from your clothes. Until I mentioned it, you probably weren't noticing that input. It was in the background. When it's in the foreground, you're able to kind of edit it out, not notice it. When it comes to the foreground, you're having to pay attention to it. It costs you a little bit of your quota of attention for any given activity. That's what's happening also to our children. Many children don't notice inputs because everything's background. Other children may have everything foreground. Think about the fact that you would go into a Walmart and not be able to ignore anything that's happening. No wonder our children have temper tantrums in places like that. So you want to think about, are they bringing this input, pushing it back so that they don't notice it, or are they reacting as intensely to your voice as you're talking to them as they are to the white sound in the background, or to things moving in their periphery. Sometimes they react even more to things that should be background than to things that should be foreground. So all of those properties of sensation contribute to the sensory modulation and sensory registration process. And I think it's important for us to experience all of the complexity of sensory input so that we can start to understand what our children are going through as they try to get through their day. So I want to talk about two different kinds of sensory input. The first is sensory modulation. Sensory modulation is a problem in registering the input. It's the ability to grade your response to sensation. It's related to the intensity of the input as you perceive it and your threshold to sensory experiences. Do you have a low threshold, or is your threshold a little bit higher? If my threshold is low, it doesn't take much input for me to start registering it and to start interacting with it. If it's high, I may need a little bit more sensory input. So both of those contribute to my sensory modulation capacity. There are two primary types that I'm going to talk about. Over-responsivity. You may have heard of this in terms of sensory defensiveness or tactile defensiveness. These are the children that tend to respond to everything as if it's an assault. It's almost as if normal sensory experiences are painful for the children. And there is some thinking that there may be a crossover to the pain pathways, or at least the pain aspects of the central nervous system. So it isn't that I don't like that touch, but that touch is hurting me. These children let you know that there's a problem. There's also children who are under-responsive. These children who are under-responsive are those children who don't notice a lot. It seems like they're inattentive, or these children may be aware of the fact that they need more sensory input and are under-responsive, and so they run around like crazy trying to take in more sensory input so that they can reach their threshold and begin to interact. It's very difficult to teach a child who is under-responsive because they're not noticing a lot of what you're doing. I'll talk much more about sensory modulation in the next few minutes. The other aspect of sensory processing or sensory integration dysfunction that I want to talk about is dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is a problem in doing. It's the inability to conceive of, plan, and execute unfamiliar activities. Think about it as a child going to a new playground and being able to figure out what it is that they want to do on that playground. Okay? So there are 3 steps in sensory or in praxis or dyspraxia. The first step is ideation, looking at the environment and saying, oh boy, I can do. The Gibsons talk about it as perceiving affordances, perceiving the possibilities for action in the environment and figuring out the goal for what you want to do. I want to climb on that thing. I want to dig to China if I'm in a sandbox. The next aspect of it is motor planning, figuring out how to get your body to do it. This is the most sensory-based aspect. This is the part of praxis in which you're taking prior experiences, the memory trace, the sensory trace of that, and using that to plan and formulate the new movement. I know what it should feel like, therefore I can plan the next movement. And then finally, you're executing it. The important thing to remember is we see what precedes ideation and we see what the child does, but we don't necessarily see the planning that goes on. But I want you to have an experience of not being able to motor plan. So I want you to do what I'm doing here. Do this. So you're touching your ear and your nose, and you're crossing your hands over. Even those of you who think that you're coordinated are probably having some difficulty doing this. Are you impressed with my ability to do it? It's taken me years. But the idea is that when you're doing that, a lot of you might be hitting your hands in the middle, and so you're sort of doing this kind of thing, or you're kind of, hitting in the middle and you end up like this. So it's really that process of being able to integrate the two sides of your body, being able to do something smoothly and sequentially, and doing it from a proprioceptive awareness of your body, not necessarily seeing yourself do it. Actually, if you tried to do it in a mirror, it might be even more difficult. So the idea is that the clumsiness that you feel when you're trying to do this is really what a lot of our children feel when they're engaged in any activity. Think about handwriting. And I know that many of our children with autism are not necessarily doing handwriting, but it's a good example for us. How effective would our ability to write be if we had to think about the formation of letters all the time? We had to think about forming the letters, upswing now, let's go this way, let's go down. The way we think about it when we teach children to write, it wouldn't be very efficient. We wouldn't be able to convey the language or the thought behind our writing. We'd be stuck in the motor aspect of the task, which is really the least important aspect of the task, but it's a limiting aspect of the task. And that's where the problem is in a lot of our children with autism who have difficulty initiating movement. The other aspect that a lot of our children with autism have problems with is ideation. Think about the fact that these are children who want to do the same thing. They can't take in novelty. They're not able to take in new sensory information from the environment and figure out something new to do. These are children who do the same thing over and over again because they've learned it, they've overlearned it, and there's comfort in that. I'm not saying that's the only reason that they have an intolerance to novelty, but it's a major reason for a lot of our children. Okay? So let's go back to sensory modulation disorder and talk a little bit more about this process and how to see our children a little bit differently. So I talked earlier about the fact that some of us have a low threshold and some people have a high threshold. But the reality is that most of us are right here in the middle, and it doesn't get in the way of our ability to participate in our environment. If I have an extremely low threshold, that means that normal ambient experiences, things that all of us deal with in our environment, may be too much. So there's a tendency to over-responsivity in those individuals who have low threshold. If I have a very high threshold, these are the children that have a tendency to under-responsivity. I talk about these kids as kind of the ozone kids. They're sitting in the back of the classroom. They're really quiet. They're non-responsive. They tend to seem like children who are not necessarily capable, maybe some cognitive limitation. They're missing a lot. They're a beat or two behind the other children in the class. These are the children that often don't necessarily get identified. And if they're children who are under-responsive and on the autism spectrum, then you've got children that are very, very difficult to reach. It's difficult to get in there. It's hard to find out how am I going to find a way in to teach, to relate to this child? How do I find that motivation? Our under-responsive kids tend to be under-identified, and they need so much from us to be able to get in. Winnie Dunn, an occupational therapist in Kansas City, talks about the fact that children have innate patterns that are based on their coping strategy. Now, the coping strategy may not be seen quite so clearly in our children with autism as children with just sensory processing disorder or children with learning disability or ADHD. But I want to talk about these patterns because it tells us about the different behavioral results of different coping patterns that we might see in your children. First of all, we've got our threshold. Again, we have an innate low threshold. which can lead to increased sensitivity, or an innate high threshold, which can lead to decreased sensitivity. But then we have to think about, well, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to cope passively and act in accordance with my threshold, or am I going to cope actively and try to compensate for my threshold? This sensory should be over here. We'll change it on your handout. So that should be attempts to compensate for threshold and sensory avoider in this box. We'll change it in the handout. So in children who have a low sensory threshold and they're acting in accordance with threshold, they're pretty easy to understand. This is the classic tactile or sensory defensive child. You touch them or you hug them and they scream. They have a tantrum. They're overwhelmed by their environment. They tend to be fearful because everything is perceived of as attacking them. These are the children who look like they're feeling pain when they are touched or when they hear a sound, the ones that cover their ears to certain frequencies of sound. In contrast, you may have some children who have a low threshold. They are overwhelmed, but they get it, and they respond to it by shutting down. These kids are really concerning because the assumption is that if I'm sensory avoidant, I am not responsive to the environment. I'm shut down. I'm not looking at you. I'm really focused internally. And that internal focus is taken by observers often as I don't notice anything. But what you've got really is a child who, if you measure them physiologically, would be highly over-aroused, but they look under-aroused. And this is a really important point. What you see is not necessarily what you get. I may be behaviorally shut down, but if you looked at my underlying physiology, my heart rate is really up. My gastrointestinal system is highly activated. You really want to assume that any child who is shut down is into a physiological shutdown state. They are focusing internally to avoid focusing externally. A lot of adults with autism, and I do recommend that you read accounts written by adults with autism. I think the two most effective are Temple Grandin and Donna Williams. Donna Williams wrote a couple of books, Nobody Nowhere and Somebody Somewhere, which are excellent books about the experience of having autism. And what Donna Williams does is she teaches children with autism how to develop some stereotypies. And she teaches them to take their arms and just rhythmically pat the arm. And by patting the arm, what she's telling them to do is let me pay attention to this calming, rhythmic, regular activity, and then I can shut you out. I don't need to see you. I'm just paying attention to myself. I'm finding my own internal rhythm. And that's what you see in your sensory avoidant children. Your sensory avoidant children are purposefully shutting you out. Sometimes it's involuntary, but they're still shutting you out so that they can protect themselves from the world. So they look under-responsive, they look shut down, and your tendency is to want to go in there and give them more. That can be very, very disorganizing to the children. In contrast to these children with low sensitivity or low threshold and increased sensitivity, you want to think about your children with high threshold or decreased sensitivity. If I'm acting in accordance with my threshold, I have sensory under-responsivity. So if I'm sensory under-responsive, I am not noticing a lot of things in the world. And these kids are in your classrooms. These kids are there and they're quiet. And they're the kids that are identified as good. You know, if I've got 20 kids in my classroom and there's one little girl who's being really quiet in the background, I'm not going to think that that's a child that I need to focus on. But think about it. These are children who need more from us but are asking less. So they're spending a lot of their time sub-threshold, not noticing the world. And when you're thinking about these children, you want to give them some intense sensory input. But you can't go from understimulated to chaos. If I go from understimulated to chaos, what you're going to do is overwhelm them. You need to introduce them to the sensory world very, very slowly. So under-responsive children are very much under-identified. I find that as an occupational therapist, I get referrals on these children usually at a much later age, usually around 8. Obviously, if they're on the autism spectrum, they'll be identified earlier. Okay? In contrast to your under-responsive child, you may want to look at your sensory seeker. The sensory seeker is a child who has an innately high threshold, but makes it their business to get their sensory needs met. These are the children that are bouncing all over the classroom. These are the children that are constantly in motion, who are moving everywhere, and who also are kind of scary because they don't recognize things like gravity. These are children that often are getting hurt, and they're sometimes identified as having dyspraxia because they seem accident prone. But they're accident prone not because they're clumsy, but because they're ignoring the laws of gravity. And that's one of the things that you just can't do. You can't ignore gravity. You are going to get hurt. These children are risk takers. So sensory seekers may look very much like the sensory over-responsive child. So you want to think about, do I have a child that's actively seeking out sensation and trying to get their threshold needs met? Or do I have a child who is over the threshold and just disorganized and bouncing off the walls? If I've got a child that's bouncing off the walls, I'm going to have to think about things to calm them down. If I've got a child that's actively seeking input, I need to think about a way to give them sensory input that's going to leave them above threshold but still organized. So I might want to think about providing proprioceptive input rather than just vestibular input that can leave that child very, very disorganized. I also want to discriminate between the sensory avoidant child and the under-responsive child. The sensory avoidant child is non-responsive to the environment because it's overwhelming. The sensory under-responsive child is non-responsive to the environment because they haven't noticed it yet. What you want to think about is putting the child in a very organized environment and then slowly bringing in calming and organizing input. Again, that's probably going to be proprioception and maybe pressure touch, so that you can start to think about bringing that child into a much more organized way. What you're doing is down-regulating the child who is over-responsive and up-regulating the child who is under-responsive. So what you want to think about is this. You've got increasing sensory input as you go through your world and start to experience your world. You have a threshold. Your threshold may be high or it may be low. As I get increasing sensory input and as I get increasingly close to my threshold and somewhat above my threshold, I have increasing organization. But there's a point above which you have decreased behavioral organization. In psychology, they talk about it as an inverted U. So what you've got is increasing organization up to this point and then decreasing organization. Think about yourself. At the end of the day, you're really organized, you're really productive, and then you hit your wall. What happens when you get your wall? I get stupid. You know, I start missing things, my attentional skills aren't really good, and that's what happens to our children too. Regardless of whether I've got a high threshold or a low threshold, there's still a period of time after I hit my threshold where I'm organized. And then there's this part above where I'm into behavioral disorganization. And what you want to think about is that period of disorganization is the child's way of saying, I need to come down, I need to down-regulate. And that needs to be our job as teachers and clinicians working with these children. We need to figure out, where is the child? Are they in here? in their zone of optimal organization, or are they above it in their zone of behavioral disorganization? So it's more like this. We have our baseline, we have our threshold where we start learning and interacting with our environment, and then we have our wall where we start getting disorganized. Within the zone of optimal organization is where all of us want the children to be. This is where the children are doing interaction. This is where they're starting to be available to us socially, emotionally, and cognitively. This is where you want to teach. This is where I want to do the play. And what we want to think about is what's going on with these green arrows and what's going on with the red arrow. We want the green arrows. We want to be able to upregulate into the zone. We want to be able to downregulate out of behavioral disorganization, and we want to be able to avoid upregulation out of the zone. So what I tend to do is use this very simple schematic as a way of understanding and observing children. What's going on just before you get behavioral disorganization? What's going on just before you get organized behavior? What kind of things calm John down? What kind of things consistently happen, whether it's something that you do on purpose, something that it's what the child does on purpose, or whether it's just every time I put him in timeout, he's calm and he doesn't want to come out of timeout. Well, maybe he's into timeout because he's figured out that that's a place that's safe for him. Maybe he's using his undesired behavior as a way of getting taken out of a situation that's chaotic and overwhelming to him, and what you're doing is essentially reinforcing the undesired behavior by putting him in timeout. Yes, I'm starting to talk like somebody who believes in behaviorism, because I do. We need to understand. So what I'm talking about is using sensory processing disorder, using sensory integration as a way of understanding the antecedents and the consequences of a behavior. So think about the antecedent behavior consequence. Use this model of up and down regulation as a way of interpreting your consequences and response to consequences and the antecedents of the undesired behavior. Because a lot of the undesired behaviors that we see in our children with autism are as a result of behavioral disorganization or as an attempt at self-regulation, because all of us want to be regulated. Think about those of you who try to regulate with food. I know for a fact that this is not an effective way to regulate myself, but I keep doing it because I get reinforced. Chocolate's good. Our children who are doing the stereotypies continue to do it because they're protecting themselves from the environment. Go back to thinking about what Donna Williams teaches her kids. Donna Williams is telling them, use this to shelter yourself. And a lot of our children figure that out for themselves. They're very good at that. They're good at protecting themselves. So think about this up and down regulation as a way of understanding and interpreting behavior. So I hope that at this point you're starting to understand the child a little bit better. Think about, how can I interpret the behavior? Spend more time understanding the behavior than trying to treat it. I think that once you start to understand where is this child in terms of their zone of optimal organization, what are they trying to do through their behavior to control it, you're going to start to better understand how that child is using sensory input or avoiding sensory input in their environment. And by understanding it, then we've got the frame for beginning our intervention plan. And so when I think about assessment and intervention, I go to this kind of a framework. I want to think about the child. I want to evaluate the child. I'm an occupational therapist. I was trained to think about the child. But just evaluating the child is not going to give me any information about sensory integration, quite frankly. I need to think about the physical environment. What does the classroom look like? What kind of experiences did the child have on the school bus on the way in? Did they sleep? I guess that's the child. But what does their bedroom look like? What kind of noise is there in the environment? How big is the room? What are the colors in the room? What what are the sounds? What else is going on that the child has to react to in the environment? Because I can't understand the child unless I look at the child in relation to the physical environment in which they have dynamically been interacting. And you want to think about the physical environment not in a static way, but in terms of over time. What has the child experienced through the course of the day? Where are they now in their arousal level because of the things that they've experienced in the physical environment? And then finally, their social environment. What are the caregivers, the teachers, the parents able to understand? Is mom a safe base? Is the teacher a safe base? Am I understanding the child? Am I, by my behavior, by my actions, actually exacerbating the child's problem? Or am I actually helping the child to downregulate or upregulate, depending on what they need? Do I understand what's going on, or am I just trying to control it? This is where I really am different than a behaviorist. I feel very strongly that sensory integration and sensory processing disorder gives us a way of understanding the child's behavior, and through understanding the behavior, we're going to better be able to control it. Because if the problem is in the physical environment, and I just try to tell the child and train the child not to do a particular behavior, what's going to happen is I might get rid of that behavior, but it's going to show up in another manifestation. I'm going to have what I call mole behaviors, where it just pops up again. You know, I get rid of hitting, and it shows up in biting, or it shows up in destroying the furniture in the room, or sitting down on the chair. I've actually had children who sit down on chairs so much that chairs have to be replaced every 4 months because they're so unaware of their body. So you want to think about, why are they doing a particular action? Not just what are they doing, but why? What's happening in the environment at the point when this child is engaging, or just before they're engaging in this object, in this activity, that helps me to understand it. So I want to evaluate both intrinsic factors, what's going on with the child, and extrinsic factors. The intrinsic factors we've talked about somewhat. We want to look at sensory reactivity across modalities and of varying intensities. So what's going on in the tactile system, auditory system, vestibular system? In children with sensory processing disorder who have autism, what you find is there's much more variability across modalities than there are in children who are not dealing with autism on top of sensory processing disorder. So what you find often is that children with autism and sensory processing disorder have problems who they seek out vestibular, they avoid tactile and auditory input, and they tend not to take in a whole lot of proprioceptive input, except through their disorganized behaviors. So there may be variability across modalities, there may be consistency across modalities. Either way, you want to think about the over or under responsivity as being a central processing problem, not a problem in just that sensory modality. And also, when you're thinking about sensory modalities, you want to think about the fact that taking in sensation is a foundation for social interaction, communication, and exploration in the environment. If I'm not able to take in and process and modulate my reactivity to sensory input, I'm not able to learn from it, and I'm not going to want to engage with it. So I'm not saying that I can cure sense or communication deficits or social emotional deficits through working on the sensory system, but I can help you to prime the child so that you can start to get the child ready for those learning activities. And also remember that children with autism usually have strength in the visual modality. And so we may want to be using that as a way of using vision to help modulate tactile, because one sensory input can help to grade responses in another sensory modality. Visual input and proprioceptive input in particular help with that. We also want to make sure that we're looking at function. How can the child's play and exploration be thought of in terms of sensory processing? Self-care. Self-care is major. Think about getting your hair cut. Think about toileting. Think about getting dressed and clothing preferences. All of these things are sensory-based. One mother that I worked with described her child as nothing was easy for this child. Everything was a major event. Her, excuse me, the children are often really overwhelmed by typical events. Think about the food preferences in this population, the clothing preferences. I could go on for hours on this, but I don't have time. The other thing is, what about tolerance for change? Excuse me. Can the children tolerate the changes that are necessary through their routines? Can they begin to tolerate the differences between home environment and school environment? And if not, why not? And one thing that's really important in this tolerance for change is to use the inconsistency of the child's performance to help you interpret what works for them and what doesn't work for them. Many of our children will do well in one situation and not in another. Rather than say that the measure or the child is inconsistent, look at why that might be, and that sort of brings us into some of the intrinsic factors. What you may have is a goodness of fit with one environment and not another. So the better you are at looking at the child's behavior across contexts, the better you are at understanding that goodness of fit. And when you find behavioral organization in one situation, you want to try to understand why I've got it here as opposed to not having it here. We also want to look at the child's development. The stereotypies are really important to understand because, again, so many of the stereotypical behaviors are self-regulatory attempts. And I say attempts because often they're pretty intrusive. But if the child is using a behavior, an undesired behavior, to regulate themselves, you're not going to be able to get rid of it by just behavioral strategies. And then you also want to look at praxis, in particular ideation and motor planning. Does the child know how to interact with their environment? With your under-responsive children, often you have a child that is clueless. They don't respond to the environment, but they're just as equally clueless about their environment. These are the children that are tripping all over everything because they don't know where their body is in space. They're not grounded in their center. If I'm not grounded in my center, I'm not able to learn how to interact with my environment. So those are the intrinsic factors that you want to look at. And then extrinsic factors, I want to look at the social environment. I want to look at the parents and teachers to think about their priorities, cultural factors, and their understanding of the child. Similarly with the teacher, I want to look at the priorities in the classroom, the understanding in the classroom. I want to think about how does the teacher's method of interaction, how does the child react to the teacher's method of interaction? Are you a teacher who tends to get louder and louder and louder to get a child's attention when you may know that, sometimes you can just whisper and you can get more attention from whispering? It's really that idea of playing on novelty. So do parents understand that? Do they understand that more is not always better? What about the siblings? Are the siblings an asset? Are the siblings competing with your child, with the identified child, for attention? And what effect does that have on the parent and the home situation? How about peers? Is the child even aware of peers? And then the physical environment, the home, the classroom, and other problem settings. Where does the child have the meltdown? Think about where it is. If I have a meltdown in places of chaos, then I'm going to start to think that this is a child who's over-responsive, whether they're shut down or not. It may be over-responsivity that's framing that. So always do as good of an observation of the dynamic context, both social and physical, as you do of the child. In looking at the child, mostly what you're going to be doing is observations. Again, look at the child across contexts. In OT, we're big on activity analysis, but try to understand the why of the behavior. I talk about the self-regulatory attempts in terms of the 4 A's, and the 4 A's are arousal, affect, attention, and action. So think about those different aspects of performance. Think about the sensory system and profile, and think about the communicative or self-regulating intent of the behavior. Sensory history. I'd spend a lot of time talking to parents. I think that the tendency of people to dismiss parents and say they're not reliable is disrespectful. I think that parents know their child better than any of us do, and that parents see the child under different conditions, and that we need to think about the fact that what the parents report may be very different than what we see in the classroom or in our clinic situations. That's because of the differences in our context and our demands on the child, not because the parent doesn't understand their child. And also, if a child has meltdowns, this is something I've experienced many times in talking to parents, the child basically does really well in school but falls apart every day when they get home. I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think that sometimes that's because it's safe to lose it at home, that they're finally not needing to control themselves so much. So if you think about the sensory avoidant child, the sensory avoidant child is really working very hard to avoid sensory experiences that may be overwhelming to them. And so that child may have a lot of difficulty. And then I do use standardized or structured assessments. Sometimes I'll use the Mullen scales of early learning, the Miller assessment of preschoolers, or the sensory integration and praxis tests. But with our children with autism, very often those tests are not available to them. We need to be very selective in our use of standardized instruments. Intervention with these children is really difficult, and it needs to be multifocal. First, we want to work with families and demystify the behavior, help them to understand their children better. So we want to help the parents reframe and explain their child's behavior. They need to reframe for themselves, and they need to explain for everybody else in their child's world. We want to demystify it. That's what Pat Wilbarger calls it. These kids don't make sense. What they do needs to be understood if we're ever going to get a handle on it. I spend a lot of my intervention time working with families, not necessarily with the child. I want to validate their observations. I want to help them to recognize the child's cue. I feel like a lot of children with autism and children with sensory processing disorder are talking a lot about their sensory needs. And by talking, I mean that they're using a lot of communicative cueing. And what they're finding out is that I can't change the behavior of my partner. If I can't change the behavior of my partner through my communicative cueing, maybe there's no reason to talk. I think about communicative intent in these children and the fact that often we as adults don't respond to their communicative intent. And so what I want you to think about is step back when you're looking at the child's behavior and say, are they trying to tell me something? And so I'm always helping parents and other caregivers to try to translate that behavior into something communicative. Because if I shut down communicative intent before language develops, then I'm really going to be having problems in helping that child to develop language. I want to help them understand how to read and act on the child's sensory cues. I want to help them build routines to support organization and foster development. I find that DIR is a very good approach. That's the Greenspan approach, which is developmental, individualized, and relationship-based. And an important part of building that routine is often what we do is ignore when the child is not doing well or is quiet. And those are the times that we really want to be reinforcing the child rather than giving them our attention only when they're doing something problematic. The other thing that I think is really important is to help the families that we're working with help others understand their children. For the most part, it's nobody else's business what's going on with the child, but these parents feel very much judged when they're out in the community and also within their families. We need to help them have a way of not giving a lecture about sensory processing disorder or autism to the other families or to other adults, but to help them have a quick way of saying, I'm dealing with this in this way, and this is why he does this, so that they understand. And the important times to do that may be at holidays. When everybody is looking forward to going over to Aunt Sarah's for Thanksgiving, you may have a family that's dreading that because they know that that's a break in the routine and it's chaos and everybody's going to want to touch the child or whatever. They need to prepare for those things ahead of time and plan for them. Think about having a quiet space in the back. Help them to proactively think about what the next step is. And then the other thing that we need to do when we're thinking about working with our parents is illustrated in this Kathy cartoon. And so in this cartoon, what you have is grandma playing with the baby. And what you've got is grandma leaning over to pick up the baby, and she's saying, here, Zenith, can Aunt Grandma help you? And mom says, no, by locating an object out of sight, Zenith learns the dual lesson of object permanence and abstraction. Here, sit on my lap. We like to use her sit time to increase vestibular competency by practicing linear or rotary movements. Rock-a-bye baby. Oh, wait, we're presenting auditory stimulation on the left side this month to promote the bilateralism so critical to brain cell development. And what this Kathy cartoon does is help us to understand a little bit the experience from parents' perspective. We don't want to jargonize their environment. We don't want to make them therapists. We want to be able to reinforce their ability as a parent to understand their child. We don't want to therapize every interaction that the parent has with the child. What I tell parents is that the mom hat is the most important hat you own. And if you can't do everything that I tell you to do, that's okay, because your love, your interaction is much more important. And so we don't want to disempower our parents. I don't think we have the ability to empower them, but we can disempower them. And I think Kathy reminds us of that. So our goal is to help them understand, not to turn them into us. That's why we get paid the big bucks, right? Okay, environmental modification or goodness of fit. Our second goal is to create a goodness of fit between the physical and the social environments in which the child needs to interact. We have to do that through collaboration. We collaborate with the family and the education team to redesign their routines. We want to think as a team. How can we make this environment fit? By giving the child a cool down, are we helping them to be able to deal with the fact that it takes them a long time to recover from sensory information? So we give them a cool down time in between activities. Our goal for creating goodness of fit is to reduce the immediate stress in recurring situations. It's not to cure sensory integration deficit, it's to manage it. What we're thinking about is getting the child from this situation of behavioral disorganization back into the zone of optimal organization. So our goodness of fit programming is to create experiences in which the green arrows become more frequent than the red arrows. Okay? So we're improving goodness of fit through that way. Activities need to be eliminated, introduced, or modified to support attention and motivation. And we really need to be thinking about each child's sensory profile in a very, very dynamic way. Our outcome is short-term change. And you'll hear it discussed in terms of sensory diet. So we're using this up and down regulation model to introduce the red arrows and introduce the green arrows and avoid the red arrows. Intervention focused on creating goodness of fit is about changing the environment. What we're thinking about is changing the dynamic properties of the environment to fit the child's need. And the problem often is the environment, not the child. So we want to also make sure that we remember to reinforce and support all of the child's attempts at sensory-based self-regulation. I want to show you this picture. This was a picture drawn by a child who's about 11 a little bit older than the age range we're talking about, and obviously at a higher functional level than a child with autism. But he had pretty significant sensory over-responsivity. And the therapist that he was working with, which was a psychologist, came up with the word bajiggity to explain what it felt like to be in the behavioral organization above his zone of optimal arousal. And so I asked him when I was consulting with her to draw me a picture of what bajiggity looked like. And this is what he drew when I asked him what bajiggity felt like. And it's an incredibly eloquent picture. It's like he has no differentiation and he's vibrating within. And then I asked him, what does it feel like when you do your exercises? They called the sensory diet activities to down-regulate exercise. And this is what he drew. Do you think he understands his zone of optimal organization? He's got dimensionality. He's not vibrating. He's happy. I think that this shows us that kids can understand it and that there is a real physiological substrate to what we're talking about here. And I love the word bajiggity too. So again, for sensory diet, we want to think about how the children are using that input. What do they seek out and what do they avoid? And also take our understanding of sensory input and sensory experiences. What's the arousing and calming and organizing potential of that sensory input? And then we have to take our knowledge and think about what's the subjectivity for this particular child? What's the child's unique response? And then we want to bring our understanding of stereotypical and problematic behaviors. Is there a sensory basis to a lot of the problematic behaviors? If they serve a self-regulatory function, then you want to do a subsequent analysis where you're thinking, are there attempts at self-regulation adaptive, disruptive, or unsafe? And then you want to frame your responses. If the child is hitting others or biting, that's unsafe. That's a behavior that needs to be dealt with now, immediately. If it's adaptive but it doesn't look good, then we may have to live with it. If it's disruptive, you as a teacher, you need to deal with the children in your group. So you have to do something if it's disruptive to other children. But you may not need something as severe as if it's unsafe. So again, think about the response that you're using in your programming and your sensory diet depending on the significance of the behaviors. And a lot of this kind of analysis is in a book called Is It Sensory or Is It Behavior, which I will put on the reference list. So you want to think about a sensory modality. You have the ability within each modality to organize or calm or alert. So for example, within the visual modality, visual looming can be very alerting and arousing. That's what we were doing with the hand to the face. A calm environment where it's not too distracted, where you don't have a million pictures up and it's calming colors and you don't have fluorescent lights in, is going to be more organizing. Just like vestibular, linear vestibular rocking is very organizing, whereas rotary stimulation is very alerting. We will provide a handout where some suggestions for calming and alerting inputs will be on the handout. It was a little bit too cluttered for the slides, so that will be provided with your slides. And then finally, there's direct remediation for sensory processing disorder. Direct remediation is one-on-one, it is individualized, and it is based on current dynamic assessment of the child's arousal and regulation capacities today. Not yesterday, not this morning, but right now when they walk in the room. It is constantly changing. It is not protocol-based. There is no book that's going to give you do this and then do this. It's an active, dynamic, and very complex clinical reasoning process which is provided by a specially trained occupational therapist. Just attending classes and webinars is not enough. You really do need to be mentored to be able to do this. I actually was fortunate to be mentored by Jean Ayers and discovered that until I was, that I really wasn't doing it necessarily right. So that's concerning. You need certain properties of the interaction when you're doing sensory integration-based treatment. First of all, you need a sensory enriched environment. I think about the sensory environment as being on a rheostat. You know those lights in your dining room where you go up and down. So sometimes you need calming input. You need to down-regulate the child. What I find is the most common mistake when people are providing sensory integration treatment is that everything is more. It's more sensory input, more vestibular, more rotary. It's following the child into chaos. That's not what we want. We want to think about, here's a child that's really overstimulated and he wants vestibular. Okay, how do I use the vestibular drive and motivation to help him to downregulate? Maybe I need to provide more pressure touch. Maybe I need to provide more proprioception. Maybe I need to provide that vestibular in a slow rocking way. So you're constantly thinking about how to adjust that rheostat. It's also relationship-based. You are trying to get the child to take risks. That child needs to trust you. You need to work on relating to that child. So it's very much relationship-based. One of the things that I learned most from Jean Ayres was how to connect with the children. Something that's not usually talked about, it's part of the underground practice that we all do, but connection and trust and playfulness within that relationship is essential. It's also child-directed. We're using collaborative activity choice. If I am telling the child, do this, then do this, then do this, and making up the rules, guess what? I'm improving my own praxis and my own organization, but not necessarily having an effect on the child. And even our children with autism have drive to explore sensory experiences. It's one of the best ways in that we have. So we want to think about organizing the environment before the child enters it so that their choices are limited and all of them have therapeutic potential. It's playful. They should be having fun. If the child does not want to go to their SI treatment, something wrong is going on there. They should be looking forward to it. For children over the age of about 2 years of age, and I'm talking developmentally, you probably need a sensory clinic. A specialized environment needs to be available so that you can have the flexibility to really use that rheostat to up and down regulate the sensory input the child is getting. And the child needs to be actively engaged in every activity. You should not be passively administering sensory input. And the child needs to be successful in their engagement, in whatever adaptive activity you're asking them to do. And it may be something as little as asking them to help you put away something or drag a piece of equipment that you need in the environment or get rid of you, push you away, whatever it is. They need to be successful, and what your challenge is to grade the challenge that they're integrating in. So that's what I have to tell you, so go out and do good. So I look forward to our interaction online, and I hope to be able to answer some of your questions. Thank you.